want to see how you react to this sentence. Dubai is an Indian city.
I mean, I would say it's more a South Asian city. I think for Indians and for Pakistanis, it very much feels like a South Asian space. 3 terms that circulate in the Gulf: local, which means citizen; expat, which refers to more middle class and elite immigrants; and migrant worker, which refers to the primarily male working class population of the country. I have been challenging that because I am a migrant worker. I came here for my job.
I had this interaction. I was in Dubai at the time, and I was talking to my taxi driver, and I was asking him, how did you first come to Dubai? He looked at me, he was like, I took a visa, I came for work, just like you.
Citizenship is important. I don't want to deny its importance because I know the difference between what my American passport gets me and what my husband's Ugandan passport gets him.
What is the big deal? Why should I be worried that Northwestern has a campus in Qatar? Why should I be worried that NYU has a campus in Abu Dhabi? Hey, welcome to the Afikra podcast. My name is Mike Yamhenna. Today on the series, we have Neha Vora, who is a professor of anthropology at the American University of Sharjah. She's the author of 2 books, Impossible Citizens, Dubai's Indian Diaspora, and Teach for Arabia, American University's Liberalism and Transnational Qatar. The first came out in 2013, the second came out in 2018. Neha, welcome to the series.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
Maybe I'm kind of curious. You've lived a bunch of different places. How would you describe living in Sharjah as a professor of anthropology?
It's actually quite great. I've been coming and going. I lived in Dubai for my dissertation research, which turned into Impossible Citizens. Then I lived in Qatar on and off while I was doing the research in Doha on American universities. But this has become hopefully a permanent move. I got to Sharjah in August of 2023. It feels very much like home to me because I've been coming and going from the Gulf for a long time. It's also a very good time to leave the United States. So it's been, there's so much about this place that, especially being South Asian, is very convenient, and even the teaching experiences are much more cosmopolitan and global. So that's also been really great.
Amazing. I want to start with your first book. I know that I should say that it's been over 10 years since you wrote it. But so I kind of want to start not necessarily about the book itself, but about the subject of the book. I've heard the following sentences a couple times from a lot of different people, and I want to see how you react to this sentence. Dubai is an Indian city. Does that sound right to you?
I mean, yeah, it does. I mean, I would say it's more a South Asian city than an Indian city. And I think in some part of my book, I think I might have even titled a section, Dubai is an Indian city. I think for Indians and for Pakistanis and maybe for other South Asians, it very much feels like a South Asian space. You can basically go through your entire day and never speak a non-South Asian language, depending on what part of town you're in and who you're interacting with, getting in a taxi cab, speaking to the guy who brings your talabat order, the janitors and gardeners and cleaners and everyday service workers, for the most part, are South Asian. And so that, in that way, yes, especially at the time that I was doing the research, in particular neighborhoods, it very much felt like you were in South Asia and not in the Arab world. But I have heard from Arab friends very similar things too, that they feel like it's a very Arab city. So if you're Egyptian, it feels like an Egyptian city. If you're Levantine, it feels like a Levant city. Even for Turkish folks, it feels like a Turkish city. For Iranians, it feels like an Iranian city. So I think there's so many layered histories of migration and settlement here that these diasporic communities are incredibly rich, and they're, you find them not just in little tiny enclaves, but you find them dispersed throughout the country. So you can form community here quite easily and feel like that is the primary community that exists in the space.
Yeah. Like community is different than citizenship, right?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. So can you just describe the differences?
Yeah. So in us, country like the UAE or Qatar, the citizens, the people who have legal passport belonging to the country, and even in there's a lot of stratifications, but we might not have time to get into that, make up slightly over 10% of the population. So we're talking about countries, and Gulf wide, I would say it's about 50% or so of the population is immigrants. So we're talking about, especially in a place like Dubai, almost everybody is a quote unquote expat or immigrant or migrant worker, or however you want to utilize those terms. And if you want, we can talk about what I think about those different terms.
Yeah, they're used very differently, and they
Yeah,
have different baggage.
yeah, absolutely. So that does not preclude the fact that people really feel a sense of belonging here, right? They have very rich communities that have been built up over time. People have their temples, their churches, their gurdwaras, so they have religious community spaces. They have India Club and Pakistan Club, and then they have educational institutions and lots of different things to kind of build up a sense of a diaspora community, way more of a diaspora community than I would ever find in the United States, which also has a lot of South Asians, but it's not quite so dispersed across space, and it's not quite as integrated into the everyday lives of other folks. So, for example, Emiratis often speak some kind of South Asian language. They'll go to the first-run Bollywood films. They go out to eat in Desi restaurants. So, like, there is more of an integration between South Asian culture and heritage and Emirati culture than you would find between, say, South Asian culture and American culture, which is where I'm from. So community is quite established and quite deep. It's just also marked by ongoing transients where people are moving in and out. Some people stay for their entire adult lives. Other people come for a few years and then go back. The back and forth possibilities between South Asia and the Gulf also make that sense of this being South Asia even stronger, because you always know, like, what's the hottest new trend, what's going on. The political landscape there is spoken about constantly in this context, whereas in the US or UK we feel a little more distanced, from that kind of stuff. So I don't know, did that answer your question?
Yeah, it's interesting because it's like, I want to talk about the difference between those terms before we move on. The difference between expat and migrant worker. What's the difference?
So often, migrant worker is used to talk about people who are low wage, or sometimes they'd be called unskilled, although that makes no sense. People who are building our skyscrapers obviously have skills. Otherwise, they wouldn't be able to build the skyscrapers that they've built for us.
They don't use ChatGPT to build them, I'll tell you that much.
No, yes, exactly. I would say in a lot of ways, maybe they're even more skilled, way more skilled than my students who do use ChatGPT to do everything. So technically, and this is what I talk about in Impossible Citizens, there's this kind of like three terms that circulate in the Gulf: local, which means citizen; expat, which refers to more middle class and elite immigrants; and migrant worker, which also sometimes called bachelors, which refers to the primarily male working class population of the country. Although you could also use migrant workers to talk about domestic workers or women that are working in these kinds of positions as well. I have been challenging that in my research because I am a migrant worker. I came here for my job, right? So it doesn't make any sense for me to be like distinguishing myself in a particular kind of way from other folks. That structurally, even though I'm much more privileged with my salary and the benefits that I get, structurally we're within the same system, we're governed by the same system. The term that I prefer is immigrants, because I think that we tend to presume that immigrants means some kind of like path to legal belonging. And more across the world, that is not the case. We see so many of these temporary migration regimes, these guest worker regimes, becoming more and more the norm. And we don't use the term migrant in those contexts, we use the term immigrant. Even when we talk about legality and illegality of migration in the United States, we call them illegal immigrants or unauthorized immigrants. So in a way, not using the term immigrant to talk about what's happening in the Gulf and what people's lives are like in the Gulf further exceptionalizes the Gulf, as if what's happening here is somehow unique and different from what's happening in other parts of the world when it's not.
Wait, but do people say that? I mean, like, if you are a like an Argentinian living in whatever, Japan, do they describe themselves as, or like living in Nigeria or Kenya or whatever, do they say, oh, you're an immigrant to Kenya?
That I'm not sure, because those are
Yeah.
not two
I mean,
areas that
obviously, I'm throwing this at you, but
but I think you'll probably see expat used interchangeably with immigrant. But in Western countries, we use the term immigrant
yeah,
regardless of status, right? So that's kind of what I'm.
yeah. It's interesting. It's so funny. I had this interaction a couple weeks ago. I was in Dubai at the time, and I was talking to my taxi driver, and I was asking him, when did you move here? And I was curious about the mechanism. And I was like, how did you first come to Dubai? And he was from Bangladesh, and he was like, a visit visa.
Mhm.
And I'm like, okay. And it's so funny. He was a really funny guy, and he looked at me. He was like, just like you, same as you. He was like, I took a visit visa. I came for work, just like you. And I got here on a visit visa, and then I tried to figure it out. I found a job, and somehow I transitioned my visa. But the just like you part really tickled me, because he was like, don't exceptionalize me. I'm the same thing as everybody else, right?
Mhm.
I came here for work. I figured it out. I took a visit visa.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's where I think some of these privilege differences come into play. Like I don't need a visit visa. I can just land here and I can look for work. If I lose my job, I have much more ability to stay in the country, to move in and out of the country constantly. Whereas somebody who is from Bangladesh, right, if they lose their job, they're going to have to go back home, and then they're going to have to get another visa to come and get a job here. So some of the places where you see the social stratification is by passport. Some passports are stronger than others in terms of people's mobility.
So I want to ask you about, as like an anthropologist, how you approach this book. I know that it was a long time ago, but who did you look at, and um, why did you choose that segment of society?
So I had come up doing like my undergrad and my master's, looking at South Asian diaspora, some aspect of South Asian diaspora in the United States. And, this is the typical, like, you grow up in a white country and you're exploring your own identity, and then you become an academic, and then your academic interests align with your own personal explorations. That happens a lot if you look at the demographics of who studies what, right? So it's not surprising that I was interested in studying South Asian diaspora, but I was starting to get really tired of the literature, like that was in existence. It was all like about identity. It was a very middle class. It was very Western, very much about assimilation issues and nuclear family struggles, like intergenerational struggles and stuff. And I don't want to dismiss that stuff. It's important. It was important for me too. But at a certain point, it's just like, okay, can we be done with like these identity angst issues? And so when I went for my PhD, I wanted to look beyond the context of what the literature was, which is primarily UK, Canada, US, right? I knew there was historical literature that was looking at migration patterns under indenture and those communities. But even in those spaces like Guyana and Trinidad and things like that, there weren't a lot of ethnographic texts about those communities. And then it's just like in the back of my mind, I was like, well, Dubai is like this place that has a lot of Indian people. Like, why is there no literature on Dubai? Right? Everybody knows everybody who's South Asian knows somebody in Dubai, like has a family member that's worked there or has traveled through there or went there to go shop for the gold for their sister's wedding or whatever, right? And to the point where when I was growing up, I actually even thought Dubai was in India. It was a while before I figured out exactly where it was. It just had this
I
kind of
love it.
mystical sort of like, uh, you know, aura to it. What I found when I got to Dubai was, instead of there being a little India like you would find in many different countries, right? That India was dispersed through the city, but particularly within these older neighborhoods around the Dubai Creek, which have historically been the mercantile areas, is where you found a lot of Indian families, from lower, like from bed share working class all the way to like elite merchants, like a whole range of different classes. And so I was really interested in what is everyday life like in these neighborhoods that are now kind of facing this existential question of what's going to happen when Dubai shifts to New Dubai. All of that New Dubai stuff wasn't really there yet, but it was in the works and people were talking about it. So I was interested in the geographical bounding also of these neighborhoods, and the kind of the metabolism of them and the way that they functioned and how people engage with each other in those spaces. So the geographical bounding plus the ethno-national bounding. And then because people were not living, like that was a time when, if you were coming in as a quote unquote unskilled worker, you were usually put in labor camps. And those, I didn't have as much access to them, but I was also much more interested in the city and urban life. So yes, I did talk to many working class people, but they were people that would be like working in those spaces or living in those spaces in like shared apartments and things like that. So the reason why I call it middle class is because for me, the middle class was kind of the mark off of like who can live in apartments in the city, and also who makes enough money to be able to sponsor family members.
Yeah. Do those sort of communities in South Asia, do they view Dubai, or through your research, do you think they view Dubai as like um, a, a sort of stepping stone for upward mobility, or is it a place where it's like, I'm going on a work trip, I'm going for a little bit, I don't have any other options, I'm just gonna work. I don't think this is gonna change the trajectory of my life economically in a meaningful way. This is the best option I have.
I do think that people view Dubai as this kind of land of opportunity of, yeah, maybe I've heard some negative stories, but for me, I can change my life circumstances if I go and I work for a few years and I remit money back to my family. I definitely think that people come with those kinds of dreams. I think in some of the migration literature, there's this presumption that people who are, especially people who are, have higher education and our professionals, utilize the Gulf as a stepping stone to try to get to the West. And I'm kind of seeing in the research that students are doing and my own anecdotal experiences that just doesn't seem to be the case. I think there's a lot of people at this point who want to be here, and even if they've done things like gotten higher education in Canada and then stayed there for a few years and obtained the citizenship there, they still want to be back in the Gulf. The Gulf feels more familiar for a lot of different communities. It's close to where family members live, especially Arabs and South Asians, right? And I think there's also a big fear of like Islamophobia and racism and precarity in the United States that people want to avoid.
I feel like your book, and even just like talking to you, you're like trying to reimagine or reframe, put a stake in the ground around like what it means to be a citizen.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And that like a passport does not make you a citizen, and lack thereof does not preclude you from being a citizen.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that part of that comes from my own experiences growing up in a white town in New Jersey, right? Like that, like the constant question of where are you from, it grates at you if you're being asked that from childhood when you are an American citizen. And like, I have every right to be in the United States as much as any of my white bullies growing up, right? So I think I've always had a little bit of a chip on my shoulder about that like, and then, we can talk about it in much more structurally violent ways, right? Like, do Black men in the United States experience citizenship in its full form? And I would say no. It's, you take the carceral system, you take the policing, you take everyday forms of racism. These people have citizenship, but are they experiencing citizenship the same way that I experience citizenship? I can walk around without feeling afraid of getting pulled over or shot or anything like that, right? So if we can see that even within citizens, we have so many forms of exclusion and so many ways that that passport and the rights that it supposedly confers. I mean, look at right now, what's happening is I'm in a bunch of conversations with citizens and with permanent residents who are academics who are afraid of like, should I be traveling to the United States right now because of all this crackdown on academic freedom and stuff like that. So yes, absolutely, citizenship is important. And I don't want to deny its importance because I know the difference between what my American passport gets me and what my husband's Ugandan passport gets him, right? Like, this is a constant struggle that we're having to deal with. But it's not the end all and be all. It doesn't equal belonging. It doesn't equal affective relationship. I have much more of an affective relationship to the UAE than I think I do to the United States. And for many, many people in this world, that question is not something that's this existential question that they're constantly asking themselves. Do I have citizenship? Do I not have citizenship? They're building their communities, they're building their homes, they're building their everyday lives, and do feel a sense of connection to this place because of who else is here and the kinds of institutions that have been set up here. So yes, absolutely, I am trying to challenge that. And we can go even further and we can look at Emirati citizens and like, do Emirati citizens equally experience citizenship? And I would argue that that answer is no, right?
Why is that?
Because there's so much ethnic heterogeneity that gets erased in the Emirati national identity. So, Emirati's national identity is presented as a purified Arab with Bedouin past national identity that erases the Ajami population, which is of Persian origin. It erases the histories of slavery. It erases Baluchi and South Asian populations, Yemeni populations, like loads of people. This was a very cosmopolitan place when the nation came to be, right? So they had to create a national identity that was quite purified of much of that cosmopolitanism. So all Emirati citizens do not experience citizenship in the same way. And their citizenship can even be taken from them, if the state finds them to be too politically problematic. We also have a lot of stateless people here who, in some ways, might be the most indigenous people, but they do not have access to citizenship for multiple reasons that are too complicated for me to fully understand. But yeah, so I think I'm moving in my own thinking. Like, I think for the most part, people tend to do research on Gulf studies. People either tend to do research on migration or on like citizenship and culture of the Gulf nationals. And where I'm moving towards more is like, how do we see into this whole fabric of society in which rights and opportunities and forms of belonging are constantly shifting for everybody, and that they're intertwined.
Yeah. Do you feel like the populations, the communities and like families that you spoke to when you were writing this book, and also just like in your time in the region, your students' families, do you feel like they think of the Gulf as one place? I always think about this. Like, do they think of it as like the Gulf and like this fluid place where maybe I spent 5 years in Kuwait and then I lived in Bahrain for 10 years and then I might move to Riyadh for another 15 years and I moved to Dubai and Abu Dhabi and Sharjah and Qatar, and these are all one place. Do they think of this as one place?
Sometimes they do. Sometimes you'll find people who just like that. Like we lived 10 years in Bahrain and then we moved over here to Dubai and now we're settled in Dubai, right? But then other people will be like, Dubai is my home, not the UAE, not, you know, just Dubai. Like, so there you find a range. It kind of depends on family trajectories and where they've been. Or people will say, like let's say uh, you have a family member who's in Abu Dhabi or in Kuwait. It's from in India, they'll just say, oh, they're in Dubai. Like so. I think Dubai comes to stand in for the Gulf sometimes. Or Saudi comes to stand in for the Gulf because people don't have familiarity. Like I tell people I live in Dubai because people don't in the United States don't know where Sharjah is, right? Like it's not something they've heard of before. So I've seen both.
Okay. All right. That brings me to the second book that I mentioned, which is Teach for Arabia, which in some ways right now is a very apropos book because of what's happening in academia in the States. Can you tell me how you pitched this book when you first pitched it?
So I had a really kind of like a duality to the book, right? Where I feel like my job as an ethnographer is to tell the stories of the people that I research in ways that are legible to them and are telling their truths. So I very much wanted it to be a grounded ethnography of these branch campuses in Doha. But then I was also just really annoyed at the kinds of critiques of these campuses that were coming from almost exclusively from academics who have never stepped foot in the Gulf. And they had this like deep presumption that somehow American academia was at risk by moving into a quote unquote illiberal or authoritarian space, right?
So
And
before you keep on going, like break it down to somebody who is not an academic, right? So like somebody comes to you and they're like, what is the big deal? Why should I be worried that Northwestern has a campus in Qatar? Why should I be worried that NYU has a campus in Abu Dhabi?
well, so I would say you shouldn't be
But
worried.
why do they think
Why
you
do
should be?
they? Because they think that in the United States, we have that liberalism is the framework under which we operate, that we have freedom, that we have critical thinking, that we're unfettered by capitalist interests in the academy, that we're unfettered by the state in the academy, right? And that is a mythology that they very much abide by. So, for example, I remember somebody had made an argument when Yale was thinking of moving to Singapore. Well, Yale is in Singapore, where a Yale professor had said something like, Singapore is an authoritarian state. We put our academic principles at risk if we go to a place like Singapore where homosexuality is illegal and blah, 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 like all these kinds of things, right? And then she had said in the next statement, it would be much better to think about having a campus in a country that is the world's biggest democracy, like India. Okay, but India at the time was completely cracking down on students who wanted to do anything about like protesting about Kashmir or protesting about laws that were like India is not a bastion of liberalism, just like the United States is not a bastion of liberalism, which we see constantly, especially around Palestine, right?
Yeah. Nor
And
is Singapore. They all like the same.
yeah, and in Singapore, just because Singapore has like the state doesn't equal the people, right?
Yeah, of
And an
course.
ethnographer knows this. Like I can go and study gay people in Singapore. Even if it's legal or not legal, there are still gay people in Singapore. And if you want to study them, you can. So are we just going to cut off studying gay people in Singapore because of the law of the state? Like, it's a very problematic sort of like, way of thinking that doesn't take into account what happens on the ground. So that kind of very Orientalist, quite frankly, just knee-jerk critique of like we can't have these branch campuses. The other critique was like this is imperialist, or which I can see how it is in some ways. There are imperial entanglements between the U.S. and the Gulf that allow for these kinds of soft power like spaces to develop. Um, And within the institutions themselves, a lot of people have imperialist sort of attitudes about why they're there, that they're there to civilize the backwards Gulf citizens or something like that. And then the other critique was that this is just neoliberalism and it's just trying to um, get money from anywhere. But then what is the patent system for and all of the partnering that universities do with the Defense Department and companies in the United States? It's not like this is any different from that, right? Um, so yeah, it was an interesting.
So like, if I were to, you're basically saying this is a dirty game, so don't criticize when I have mud on my shoes.
You already have mud on your shoes.
Yeah.
You just don't want Oriental mud on your shoes. So I don't know,
I'm curious about the effect, this sort of long-term effect that these campuses. Oh, and full disclosure, if you're new to afikra, I work with a lot of these organizations, and I love a lot of these organizations, and there are a lot of great work that's happening. So, if you don't already know that, let me just put that out there. I'm curious about the long-term effects on good and maybe bad on citizenship, right? This idea of citizenship. So if you take a look at in Qatar or in the UAE, we'll just use those two examples because those are the two places that you lived when you wrote both these books. There are like a lot of really, really prominent, excellent universities in these places that are teaching these long-time residents, right? Regardless of what passports they hold, the kids of long-time residents. I'm curious about the like long-term legacy. Have you thought about that, both as an ethnographer but also as like an educator?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that one of the things that was really interesting in when I was doing the research for Teach for Arabia is how the very structure of the institutions uh, belie the uh, discourse around why they exist, right? So the discourse is we're building a knowledge economy so that we don't have to rely so much on foreign labor, so that we can diversify away from oil, and we have industries to put our citizen workers into, and we're creating a citizen worker class, right? That's the typical uh, knowledge economy riff of all of these strategic plans for 2030, 2040, blah, blah, blah. Um, you're bringing in these institutions and you're populating them with foreign professors that you have sourced primarily from Western countries. So you are increasing your reliance on foreigners in the process, right? You are funding these institutions with oil money, so you're not diversifying away from oil. The oil money is necessary for these institutions to even exist and be funded and everything. And then the majority of the people who attend these institutions are expat kids, right? So I call them local expats. So people who are like, you do have some international students and you have plenty of citizens, but the largest chunk of people are kids who grew up in are elite kids who grew up in Doha or in the UAE, and then you give some of these kids access to financial aid, and the financial aid that you give them access to is tied to them being able to have their loans forgiven if they work for a certain number of years in Qatar after they graduate. So show me how that is about reducing reliance on foreigners. You're actually encouraging your foreign resident students to work in country instead of having a brain drain and leaving the country, right? So there obviously the government understands that this is why the transnational is in the title of the book, right? That the future of this country is transnational. They're cultivating an elite of citizens and non-citizens that are meant to populate these non-oil industries that are getting built up. But at the same time, they want to tailor what that expat class looks like and have a loyal one, have one that is, familiar with the location, have one that is more elite, right? So it's really interesting to kind of see these kind of paradoxes play out within the context of the unis. The other thing that I find really interesting about the unis is, again, these are elite institutions. We have lots of um, higher education in the country, but something like an NYU Abu Dhabi is really tailored to attract more elite students.
By elite, hold on. Do you mean academically elite or you mean financially?
Both,
Okay.
right?
Because AUS, the school that you teach at, is somebody could make the argument that it's the best university in the Gulf, right? That an argument can be made that that's true. Would you say that that is also the same
I
type
would
of?
Yeah, so
Yeah.
I would say a place like AUS, which by the way,
Yeah.
Emiratis have to pay to go to, right? Our tuition is quite high. It's hard to get in, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's all of that. It's the tuition and the hard to get in.
Okay.
However, a lot of citizens can get sponsorships. I don't know how it works with AUS particularly, but for the American campuses, a lot of citizens could get sponsorships from companies who would pay their tuition, but then they would have to work for those companies. Um, so there's definitely, you do find, not as well off people in these schools, and there are financial aid structures, but, these are the same, like a Georgetown level in Qatar is the Georgetown level in the United States, right? This is an elite institution.
Yeah. Um, Going back to this idea, it's funny because I'm like, going back to this idea of citizenship, how is the presence of those universities actually changing what it looks like to be a citizen in your sort of remixed version of that term?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I'm seeing a couple of really interesting things just as a professor now on the ground, right? Like the first is that we have now graduated so many Emiratis from these institutions who are meant to be going into private sector work and are having trouble finding private sector work, right? There's still the corporate world still has a very kind of negative understanding of like negative stereotypes of thinking that Emiratis don't want to do work, that it's just weird, like that they're diversity hire token hires. And I hear a lot from my Emirati friends and former students about difficulties in the workplace in terms of like not getting treated like a equal worker to other folks. So there's some kind of disconnect is going on between, yeah, you have this great university education, but is it translating into Emiratis actually running the show? I don't see that really happening yet. The other thing that I'm seeing that's really interesting, and this was something that I saw in Impossible Citizens, which led me to the Teach for Arabia research, is a lot of these immigrant kids grow up, unless their parents are very wealthy and can send them to like British schools or IB schools, they grow up going to schools with people who are of their national background. So they'll go to an Indian school or Pakistani school or Filipino school, right? And so by the time they get to college, even though they know that they live in a multinational cosmopolitan space, their friend groups and their everyday interactions are almost exclusively have been with people like them, right? So college becomes a place where people are interacting with each other for the first time and really thinking about their place in society vis-a-vis what's my future going to be like, who are these people, why is it that some people get certain privileges that I don't get. And so I think going to college here for an immigrant kid who grew up here extends their longevity. It used to be, before we had a private higher education in the Gulf, that they would have to go back to the home country, which maybe they've never been to before, or they would have to move on to a third country to get higher education. But now being able to stay here into your 20s continuously and have access to jobs at the end of that road, I think is really creating a lot of longevity for these second generation, third generation kids.
Some people listening to this who haven't spent any time in the Gulf might be surprised by that idea of like second or third or fourth generation, especially if they're coming at this from a North American or European lens. I grew up when I was a little kid. I was born in Cyprus. I never got a Cypriot passport, and eventually moved back to Lebanon. And a lot of Lebanese have this story, whether they were born in the Gulf or born somewhere else. The ones that were born and grew up in Europe and Canada, a lot of them just like become American. They kind of just like meld into that fray, and they just become part of that idea, and they become first or second or third generation, right? Functionally, how does that happen in the Gulf? So like an Indian family who moved to Dubai in the 1940s and is like a middle class, working class family. Functionally, how do they actually stay for 3 generations? Do they like go back and then go back and come, or how does it work?
So a lot of the people that have been here for multiple generations like that are business families. So if you own a business, you do have well, I'll caveat that later, but originally you owned a business, you would have a 51% Emirati partner for your business, right?
It's like the merchant class.
Yes, the merchant class. Then you have your kids. You pass on that business to your son, who then perhaps passes it on to his son, right? So the merchant communities or daughter, the merchant communities have been here the most in a continuous kind of way, because and they, many of them were here before state formation, so they were not necessarily privy to all of these business laws and clauses that hinder people.
Yeah. How big is this community though?
It's huge. There's loads, like you go anywhere in like all of Dira and Dubai is full of merchant businesses, and
So it's not necessarily that they're wealthy. It's not that this is the sort of 1%.
some of them are at the level of the Alukas or the Jeshan Mel or something, but more it's like a family business that's getting by,
Okay.
And that has changed now, because now you can set up a business in a free zone, or you can get a visa as a freelancer. And so you don't, this reliance on the Emirati sponsor is reducing, which is also reconfiguring the power dynamics between Emiratis and non-Emiratis, because that used to be a source of income for Emiratis, right? To be now they also don't. Now I can also own my own property. So and under the new kinds of system, a middle class person can own their own property. So now they're not paying rent to an Emirati. They can own their own business. Now they're not paying rent to an Emirati, right? So a lot of these sources of income for Emiratis used to come from this kafala system of money that you got from partnering with partnering or renting things out or doing services for immigrants who couldn't do those things alone. And now what is it going to be like, right? That pushes them more into having to get salaried labor and salaried work and stuff like that. So lots of things are changing here. But the second, third generation now is an interesting mix. These end up becoming the folks who run the show, right? They're running the arts and culture organizations. They're the ones that get jobs in communications, in real estate, in media, in universities, and so you'll see that kind of crowd of kids who grew up, like the kids that I interviewed maybe 20 years ago, like are now, in their 40s, right? And many of them have stayed, and many of them are doing quite well for themselves and raising their own kids here.
Because like one of the things I always heard when I was growing up, friends of mine who were thinking about moving to Dubai and having their families there, or folks who did have their families there, specifically Lebanese and Palestinians, would say that I can't retire there, right? Like, I can't retire there. What am I going to do when I retire? What am I like? My kids will never be able, like, I will never be part of the nation. I'll never be a part of it. Is that a theme that you heard a lot, and is that changing?
So 100%, this was the standard diasporic narrative. Anybody I spoke to who was someone middle class who was raising their family in Dubai had the same. We're building a house in Bangalore. We're building a house in Karachi. We're building a house in Bombay. We're building a house in the village in Kerala. We're going to go back because at 60 here, I think in academia at 70, in some other fields it's 70 also, but mostly at 60 you're forced to retire if you're working a salaried job, right? And your job is tied, your residency is tied to your job. So as soon as you retire, you are no longer allowed to live here and you have to leave, right? So there was this kind of end date that everyone was planning for, and seemed like they were wanting to do it. Their kids were not wanting that because their kids don't feel the same kind of connection to Kerala or Bangalore or wherever, right, that they do. What I'm seeing now is a really interesting shift because a lot more families are retiring here. Like I said, now we have affordable property. Now we have 100% business ownership, right? Now we have a golden visa, which is basically the closest thing you can get to a permanent residency. It's a 10-year visa that you can get that is not tied to your employer. So if I lose my job tomorrow at AUS, I still have residency here because I have a golden visa. Most of the golden visa categories are about elites. They're about how much money you
Yeah, this
make.
is not for middle class folks, though, for sure.
But here's the thing, it can be for middle class folks. There are certain categories where middle class folks are obtaining it. You can get it as an artist.
Yeah,
You can get it as someone who works on sustainability or environment. The most interesting thing to me is you can get it if you're an outstanding student graduate of any school in the UAE, high school or college. So imagine if you're coming from an Indian school, your family is very, marginally middle class. They're just scraping by, right? And you can get an outstanding student golden visa. You can then turn around and use that golden visa to sponsor your parents, and your parents can then retire in the
for
UAE.
sure. But the nature of that, even the nature of that phrase, outstanding, right? So it's like if there's 100 kids, 10 are outstanding, right?
Yeah, but based on merit, right? Not based on
Sure.
salary. So
Definitely.
that's where you see a little bit more of a heterogeneity in,
Yeah.
who's getting these golden visas and who's retiring here. Now there's actual retirement schemes that the government has announced that you can get a retirement visa. They just announced a 5-year Pakistani visa where people can travel back and forth. So there's a lot of ways in which the government is encouraging people, which makes a lot of sense. That 40 years you spent spending to bake your house in Bangalore, now that 40 years of salary can go right into the UAE. It's a kind of brilliant move on the part of the UAE, right? And given all of the mess that is pretty much every country in South Asia right now, a lot of people don't want to go back, right? So a lot of the narratives that I hear are, and my students have done actual empirical research on this, but anecdotally, the things I hear are, well, I don't want to deal with the pollution and the rolling blackouts in India, or why would I want to invest my money in India or Pakistan? The rupee is unstable. Here, at least with dirhams, I know where my money is going. I'm not going to get cheated, right? Gender safety. I don't feel comfortable walking around on the street, or the patriarchal expectations of a extended family are things that make people not want to go, or merely my life and my friends are here and I'm used to the conveniences of Dubai, right? A lot of those things I'm hearing from a lot of people, that this idea of going to Pakistan is just now, it's not the nostalgic, wonderful, diasporic fantasy that I was being told 20 years ago,
Mhm. Okay, cool. What are you working on now before we wrap up?
So it might sound like a switch, but I'm working on stray animal care in the UAE, and I'm kind of thinking about how, we just talked about how people make home in these forms of transience or in these forms of precarity all the time, and now I'm thinking more about how these homemaking practices are also multi-species homemaking practices. So how do people incorporate care for animals into the way that they think about belonging and place. And we have a lot of stray cats in this country, but even I'm not just cats, not just part of my everyday life, and my sense of belonging in my neighborhood becomes feeding this colony of cats that I see on my walk to the metro. But it's also how people, if you go into especially some of the older neighborhoods or industrial neighborhoods, people plant gardens that have plants and trees that come from their home country and that provide food that they can use. Even in labor camps, you see people planting gardens, taking care of birds. How do these acts of care constitute community, and what does it mean for us to think in a more multi-species way about both transience and belonging?
Cool. If anyone wants to find your work, I think you're on social media.
Yes, I'm on barely on Twitter at Native Informant, and otherwise they can email me, and my email is nvora@aus.edu. I don't really have a website yet. That's somewhere on the list of many to-dos.
No worries.
It'll happen at some point.
Neha, thanks so much. I really appreciate it.
Okay, thank you.